The murder of Stanford White, the trial that divided America. On the night of June 25, 1906, a man walked into Madison Square Garden in New York City. The building was crowded, music was playing, the rooftop theater was filled with people enjoying a summer performance. The man moved calmly through the crowd. He did not rush. He did not attempt to hide. When he reached his destination, he stopped, raised a revolver, and fired 3 shots at close range. The man who collapsed was Stanford White, one of the most famous architects in the United States. The man who fired the shots was Harry Kendall Thaw, a wealthy heir from Pittsburgh. The killing happened in public. There was no escape attempt. Harry Thaw stood where he was and waited to be taken into custody. Within hours, newspapers across the country were calling it the crime of the century. But the murder itself was only the beginning. To understand why Stanford White was killed, it is necessary to go back years earlier to a young woman whose life became the center of the story. Her name was Evelyn Nesbit. Evelyn Nesbit was born in 1884 and grew up in modest circumstances. After her father died, her family struggled financially. Evelyn's mother believed that beauty could be a path to stability, and from an early age, Evelyn began working as a model. By her teenage years, she was appearing in advertisements, magazines, and illustrations. She became one of the most recognizable faces of her time. Artists and photographers sought her out. She moved in circles far older and wealthier than herself. Stanford White was one of those men. White was decades older than Evelyn Nesbit and already at the height of his career. He had designed some of New York's most prominent buildings. He was socially powerful, well-connected, and accustomed to influence. Accounts from the time describe White as charming, confident, and indulgent. He took an interest in Evelyn Nesbit when she was still very young. Their relationship would later become a central focus of the trial, discussed in explicit detail by newspapers and lawyers alike. Evelyn later stated that she had been manipulated and exploited. Stanford White, for his part, never publicly addressed the nature of the relationship before his death. Years later, another man entered Evelyn Nesbit's life. Harry Kendall Thaw was the son of a railroad magnate. He had grown up with immense wealth, but also with a reputation for instability. Accounts from acquaintances described him as controlling, jealous, and emotionally volatile. Thaw became infatuated with Evelyn. He pursued her relentlessly. When she eventually married him, the union was troubled almost immediately. Thaw fixated on Evelyn's past. He became obsessed with her relationship with Stanford White. According to testimony that would later be given in court, Thaw viewed White not simply as a rival, but as a symbol of moral corruption and personal betrayal. Over time, Thaw's fixation intensified. He spoke repeatedly about revenge. Friends later recalled conversations in which Thaw expressed hatred toward White, but few believed he would act on it. On the night of June 25, 1906, Stanford White attended a performance at Madison Square Garden's rooftop theater. He was seated at a table near the stage. Harry Thaw entered the venue later that evening. Witnesses described him as calm. There was no confrontation, no argument. When Thaw reached White, he said a single sentence before firing. Then he waited. White died almost immediately. The audience, at first confused, slowly realized what had happened. Police arrived quickly. Thaw offered no resistance. He was taken into custody. The news spread faster than any crime before it. As within days, the case dominated national attention. What followed was not just a murder trial, but a public spectacle unlike anything America had seen. The press published intimate details of Evelyn Nesbit's life. Her testimony became headline material. The trial was not only about whether Harry Thaw had killed Stanford White. That fact was not in dispute. The question before the court was why, and whether that why justified the act. As the legal process began, the courtroom filled with reporters, spectators, and social elites. Every word was recorded, every gesture analyzed. The trial would introduce the public to ideas about insanity, morality, and social power that were rarely discussed so openly. At the center of it all was a woman whose private experiences were being examined in public, and a man who claimed that his actions were not murder, but justice. As Harry Kendall Thaw was taken into custody, it became clear almost immediately that the legal case would not resemble an ordinary murder trial. There was no dispute over the act itself. Dozens of witnesses had seen the shooting. The weapon was recovered. Thaw made no attempt to deny what he had done. Instead, the focus shifted to his state of mind. From the beginning, Thaw's legal team signaled that they would not argue innocence. They would argue insanity. This strategy required the court to look backward, not just to the night of the shooting, but to the years leading up to it. To understand the defendant, prosecutors and defense attorneys alike began reconstructing Harry Thaw's life. Born into extraordinary wealth, Thaw had grown up with access to privilege few Americans could imagine. But with that privilege came instability. Testimony would later describe violent outbursts, paranoia, and obsessive behavior dating back to his youth. Family members spoke of sudden mood changes. Friends recalled erratic conduct that went unchecked because of money and influence. As the case developed, the courtroom became a place where two narratives competed. One portrayed Thaw as a calculating murderer who had planned his act carefully. The other portrayed him as a deeply disturbed man, driven beyond reason by obsession and perceived injustice. At the center of both narratives stood Evelyn Nesbit. When Evelyn took the stand, the atmosphere in the courtroom changed. She was no longer just a witness. She was the living connection between the victim and the accused. Her testimony was delivered slowly and carefully, but it carried immense weight. Evelyn spoke about her early life, her modeling career, and her introduction to high society. She described how, as a teenager, she had been drawn into social circles far older than herself. She spoke about her interactions with Stanford White, describing a relationship that she later characterized as manipulative and damaging. Newspapers reported her testimony in exhaustive detail. Some accounts were sensationalized. Others were framed as moral lessons. Public reaction was intense. For many Americans, this was the first time such personal experiences were discussed so openly in a courtroom. The defense used Evelyn's testimony to argue that Harry Thaw's actions had been driven by outrage and psychological collapse. They presented Thaw as a man consumed by the belief that his wife had been wronged and that society had protected the powerful while ignoring the vulnerable. Prosecutors, however, challenged this framing. They pointed to evidence that Thaw had planned the shooting. They highlighted his purchase of the weapon, his deliberate arrival at the theater, his calm behavior before and after the act. These details, they argued, demonstrated intent and awareness. The courtroom became a stage where expert witnesses were called to explain the mind. Psychiatrists testified about mental illness, impulse control, and obsession. Some stated that Thaw exhibited signs of paranoia and delusion. Others argued that he understood exactly what he was doing. The jury was asked to weigh not only facts, but interpretations of behavior. As days turned into weeks, the trial became a national obsession. People followed updates in daily newspapers. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse. The term "trial of the century" was used repeatedly, not because of legal novelty alone, but because the case touched on issues of class, power, and morality. At times, the proceedings seemed less like a criminal trial and more like a referendum on society itself. Was Harry Thaw a criminal acting out of jealousy and rage? Or was he a man pushed beyond the limits of sanity by a system that allowed exploitation to go unchecked? Inside the courtroom, these questions were argued methodically. Outside, they were debated emotionally. The judge attempted to maintain order and focus, but even he could not fully control the cultural force the trial had become. When closing arguments were delivered, the jury faced an unprecedented task. They were not deciding whether Harry Thaw had killed Stanford White. They were deciding whether he was responsible in the eyes of the law. After deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Harry Kendall Thaw was found not guilty by reason of insanity. The courtroom reacted immediately. Some expressed shock. Others expressed relief. Thaw was not freed. He was committed to a mental institution where he would remain under supervision. For Evelyn Nesbit, the verdict marked the end of one ordeal and the beginning of another. Her life had been exposed, analyzed, and judged publicly. She would spend years trying to reclaim privacy. For the public, the verdict raised questions that did not fade quickly. What did justice look like when wealth and influence were involved? How should the law treat crimes motivated by obsession rather than profit or revenge? And where did responsibility end when mental illness was invoked? The case did not conclude cleanly. It continued to echo through appeals, retrials, and public debate. Harry Thaw would eventually be tried again. The legal system would revisit the same questions, searching for clarity. But clarity would prove elusive. The murder of Stanford White had ended a life. The trial that followed unsettled a nation. And the story was far from over. After the verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity, the story did not settle into silence. Harry Thaw was transferred to a state institution where his confinement was framed as treatment rather than punishment. Public reaction split almost immediately. Some viewed the decision as a recognition of genuine mental illness. Others saw it as evidence that wealth could bend outcomes. Newspapers continued to follow every development. Editorials debated whether justice had been served or avoided. For many Americans, the case became less about a single act of violence and more about the boundaries of responsibility. Inside the institution, Thaw did not behave like a man resigned to confinement. He complained frequently. He challenged doctors' conclusions. He insisted that his actions had been justified. At times, his behavior appeared controlled and deliberate. At other times, it appeared volatile. These contradictions fueled ongoing debate about his mental state. Meanwhile, Evelyn Nesbit attempted to step away from public attention. That proved difficult. Her testimony had made her a symbol, whether she wanted it or not. She was discussed as a victim, as a catalyst, and as a controversial figure, often without regard for her own voice. Offers for interviews and appearances followed her. So did judgment. The legal system, however, was not finished with Harry Thaw. Prosecutors sought a retrial, arguing that the insanity verdict had been influenced by emotion and spectacle rather than evidence. Years passed as appeals moved slowly through the courts. During this time, Thaw's status shifted. He was granted periods of increased freedom within the institution. At one point, he escaped briefly, crossing into another country before being returned. Each incident reignited public interest. The question lingered. Was Thaw a dangerous man being indulged, or a troubled individual navigating a system unequipped to define him clearly? In 1913, a second trial took place. This time, the atmosphere was different. The novelty had worn off. The press coverage was still intense, but less indulgent. The court focused more narrowly on facts and less on spectacle. Evelyn Nesbit was not placed at the center in the same way. The prosecution emphasized planning and intent. The defense again raised questions of mental health, but with less dramatic flourish. When the verdict came, it was different. Harry Thaw was found not guilty. This time, the court did not cite insanity. Instead, the result reflected uncertainty. The jury was unable to establish criminal responsibility beyond reasonable doubt. Thaw was released. The reaction was immediate and polarized. Some saw the outcome as confirmation that the system favored those with resources. Others argued that the law had functioned as designed, applying standards evenly, regardless of public pressure. For Harry Thaw, freedom did not bring peace. His life afterward was marked by legal disputes, financial decline, and continued instability. The wealth that had once shielded him eroded over time. He became less powerful, less influential, and increasingly isolated. Stanford White, meanwhile, became a figure remembered largely through the manner of his death. His architectural legacy endured, but public memory attached his name permanently to the trial. His work remained visible in buildings across New York, but his story was inseparable from the courtroom drama that followed. The case reshaped how Americans thought about crime committed in public spaces. It challenged assumptions about motive. It exposed how narratives of honor, jealousy, and morality could influence legal outcomes. It also revealed how the personal lives of women could be scrutinized and repurposed within legal arguments. For Evelyn Nesbit, the years following the trial were defined by attempts to reclaim agency. She wrote, performed, and spoke publicly at times, but always under the shadow of a story that was no longer hers alone. Her identity had been shaped by testimony given under oath. That reality never fully faded. As time passed, the Stanford White murder became a reference point. Law schools discussed it. Journalists revisited it. Psychiatrists debated its implications. It stood at the intersection of violence and culture, a crime that could not be separated from the society that examined it. What made the case endure was not uncertainty about who pulled the trigger. That fact had never been in question. What endured was uncertainty about meaning. Was the killing an act of vengeance framed as moral outrage? Was it the result of untreated mental illness enabled by privilege? Or was it something less definable, shaped by obsession, environment, and unchecked power? The law answered some of these questions. Public opinion answered others. But no single conclusion satisfied everyone. As the years went on, the intensity faded, but the case never disappeared. It became quieter, more reflective, less about scandal, more about consequence. And still, it resisted a clean ending. As the years moved forward, the Stanford White case settled into history without ever fully resting there. It did not remain alive because of unanswered questions about who committed the act. That had never been in doubt. It endured because of what it revealed about how society assigns meaning to violence. Public memory shifted slowly. The urgency that once filled newspapers gave way to quieter reassessments. The courtroom spectacle receded. Remained were the implications. The case had forced Americans to confront uncomfortable ideas. That wealth could shape outcomes without explicitly breaking the law. That mental illness could be both genuine and strategically presented. That private relationships, once exposed publicly, could define lives indefinitely. Harry Thaw's later years were marked by decline rather than triumph. The fortune that once insulated him diminished. His behavior continued to draw concern, but without the same attention. He became a reminder that notoriety does not equal resolution. Stanford White's legacy returned gradually to architecture rather than scandal. His buildings remained. They stood quietly, disconnected from the noise of the trial that had once overshadowed them. Time restored part of what public attention had distorted. Evelyn Nesbit's life continued, shaped permanently by a story she had not chosen to become symbolic. She lived long enough to see cultural attitudes begin to change, to see questions asked differently, to see the early outlines of conversations about power, consent, and exploitation that had been impossible during the trial itself. But even with time, the story never resolved into a lesson that could be stated cleanly. There was no moral conclusion everyone could accept. Some believed the verdicts represented mercy. Others believed they represented imbalance. Some saw the case as proof that mental illness deserved recognition. Others saw it as evidence that recognition could be manipulated. What made the case endure was not the violence itself. It was the tension between explanation and justification, between understanding and excuse, between sympathy and accountability. Late at night, when this story is told quietly, it does not demand judgment. It invites reflection. It asks how much context should matter when harm is done. It asks whether public spectacle helps or distorts truth. It asks how many lives are shaped by a single moment that the law later struggles to define. The shooting at Madison Square Garden ended in seconds. The consequences unfolded over decades. They touched law, media, psychology, and public conscience. They changed how trials were covered. They changed how insanity defenses were debated. They changed how private lives were treated once exposed. And yet, despite all of that, the case ends without certainty. Not legal uncertainty, human uncertainty. If you were present in that courtroom, hearing the same testimony, watching the same witnesses, knowing what the jury knew and nothing more, where would you have landed? Would you have seen a man overcome by obsession? Or a man who planned, waited, and acted? Would you have felt justice had been served? Or merely explained? These questions do not ask for answers shouted aloud. They ask for quiet consideration. That is why the case remains. Not because it shocks, but because it unsettles. Because it resists a single conclusion. And because, long after the verdicts were delivered, it still asks something of the listener. As the night continues, this story can be left where it belongs. Not resolved. Not judged. Simply understood as far as understanding allows. Cases like this don't stay remembered because of the violence. They stay remembered because of the question they leave behind. Was this justice carried out by the courts, or a personal reckoning that the law later tried to explain? Different people came away from this trial with different conclusions. Some believed the verdict made sense. Others believed it revealed something uncomfortable about society at the time. If you were sitting in that courtroom in 1906, listening to the same testimony, hearing the same arguments, what conclusion do you think you would have reached? Quiet reflection keeps cases like this alive long after the verdict. Thank you for listening.